This is All India Radio. In the weekly program Current Affairs, now we bring you a discussion on various aspects of Union Budget. The participants are Economic Analyst A.K. Bhattacharya and Mathili Bhushnurmat, and Aditi Fadnis, journalist, who initiates and moderates the discussion.
The Union Budget 2018-19 was presented yesterday by Finance Minister Arun Jaitley. It is quite an important document. We all know that it's the last budget before the general election, and it was widely expected that it would be populist. The Prime Minister had indicated that it would not be populist, and opinion frankly is still divided on whether it is populist or it's not. But that apart, the budget contained some quite creative ideas on a number of issues and some ideas which may find final fruition after a few years if they are continued in present form. Mr. Bhattacharya, in your opinion, what is the biggest idea in the budget? How do you think it's going to pan out?
The big idea to my mind is obviously the one that everybody is talking about, which is the health insurance scheme of 500 million people in this country, and manner in which the finance minister talked about it, and the way Prime Minister came after in an unusual sequence of events after the Finance Minister's long speech. The Prime Minister came and spoke about it. Finance Minister later in an interview even compared it with Modi Care, something that Obama Care. So it's very clear that this is what actually it makes it an election budget. The twist in the whole scheme and the program that has been announced is that while a lot has been said about this idea, but if you look at the budget document closely, you realize that precious little has been provided for in terms of outlays. So one has to assume that probably the scheme is still work in progress. Niti Aayog may be working on it, and the structure of the scheme, the way it will be operated and how the selection will be made, what kind of people will be covered, yet to be done. So therefore doesn't require any budgetary outlays to be made right now. So I would say that this is clearly an ambitious scheme. I have serious questions about the way it works, because it is probably putting the cart before the horse. It will probably be better if you create the capacity in the hospital sector before you can hand it over to an insurance companies to decide who will get treated in what way and how the charges will be made. But nevertheless, it is an idea and it must be debated and discussed. So in my view, this is the big idea in this budget.
Yesterday, when we were listening to the questions being raised and the opinions being aired on this particular idea, one of the things that was raised was how corruption will creep into the system, because those who go in for this kind of insurance will strike a deal with the people who give them insurance to give them the money but not maybe charge them less. The Finance Minister has clarified it will be a cashless scheme.
My sense is whenever you have talked about private provision of health facilities at public cost, you run this risk. So this is private provision of medical facilities and medical care at public cost with the help and assistance of the insurance sector. So except maybe a few countries in the world, maybe in Canada, what we have seen in the US again, we have seen the system is prone to misuse and corruption, as you were pointing out. So it will require deft, skillful management of the scheme. And in my view, it will probably be better if you create and invest more in creating the hospitals, dispensaries, primary healthcare centers.
So address the supply side
first, and then you bring in these schemes. Then the negative effects of private provisioning of health at public cost, those will be minimized.
What do you think of the budget? I disagree a little bit with AKB in the sense of the healthcare scheme being the big idea, for the simple reason it's not been fleshed out fully. So it's merely an announcement of intent, and there's very little money set aside, as AKB himself has pointed out, has been thought through fully. So it sounds very good, but I would not take it entirely at face value. So for me, the really big idea, which is not a new idea frankly, and something that needed to be done, is a renewed focus on agriculture and MSMEs. And that was something that has been missing all along. The government has put in more money, but it's not money alone that makes a difference to the rural economy. It's in terms of how well you implement it. They have talked about the MSP increasing it, giving you at least 50% return over your cost, etc. So that again is something that they had talked about earlier and hasn't yet been achieved. Similarly, the ENAM project that we talked about earlier, again they've also talked about linking the international trade policy with agriculture and marketing. Maybe this time the government is serious and will perhaps do more for the rural sector. In India, it is the poor and the lower middle classes that go to vote, not the upper middle classes. So ultimately, you have to reach out to them, particularly in a pre-election budget. So I think that is a good thing. Again, MSMEs has talked about job creation, and there's also the fixed term contract for employment, which I think is very good, particularly for the small scale and the medium scale sector, because you cannot employ people indefinitely. So it is a question, you have to allow some kind of flexibility in deployment of labor. Earlier I had in just 2 sectors, now you've extended it to all sectors. So I think the focus on the rural economy, agriculture, as well as on MSMEs is the large idea, not new, but something that needed to be done and has been done this time.
But wouldn't you say that the budget has made things a little bit more complex than they were originally? Because the question of costing agricultural commodities is quite a complicated one. Do you input the cost of the land that you till as part of the commodity at the end product of the commodity? If that is the case, then we would be paying the MSP for rice would be something like 5,000 rupees. And also the cost of rice grown in Punjab would be very different from the rice grown in, say, Orissa or anywhere else.
Oh yes, there are always complications, as with anything in India, frankly. But we do have a CPA committee on agriculture cost and prices, and earlier also the MSP was based on a costing of the whatever crop you're talking about. And yes, it is true that costs vary widely across the country, so these regional variations are also taken into account. It is a very complex task. So there will be problems when especially now you're talking about extending MSP to much more than just rice and paddy and wheat. Of the 23 agricultural crops which actually are covered under MSP, but for all practical purposes there was no public procurement. So it is going to be difficult, but that is a given in India. It's going to be difficult for government to actually pay that money, because it has implications not only for your budget, it also has implications for your food inflation, it has implications for a fiscal deficit because you haven't made sufficient provision. So these are all issues, but at least you recognize that farmers do need to get something over their cost of production, as also they need to open up agriculture. So I think there's a recognition. It's a beginning, long way to go, I concede, but at least it is a beginning.
I think let me add to this, the biggest challenge on this MSP will come probably the promise that it will be 1.5 times the cost.
Yeah.
And I think that is the big challenge. And the second challenge here, I would say that the procurement agency's efficiency. Do we have procurement agencies infrastructure in this country to take care of procurement at those prices, not just for wheat and paddy, which they do not entirely satisfactorily, but 23 more new items. So I think both in terms of procurement as well as this assuring 1.5 times the price cost.
Both of you mentioned on the question of procurement agencies. Procurement agencies can be APMCs, they could be private sector companies, they could be farmers cooperative groups which band together and then sell their produce. But the fact is that you need to circumvent the APMCs, which frequently, almost always, act like a cartel and don't always ensure the right price to the farmer. They of course help the farmer also in times of distress, but they are politically very much a part of the system. Has the budget suggested something that circumvents the APMC? Is it just admiring the problem?
Madhya Pradesh has got very interesting experience in. Telangana has also followed. Haryana has done it for a couple of horticultural products, where they have something known as a price deficiency scheme, where they pay the farmer the difference between the price that he realizes and the average price over the past 2 or 3 seasons. So even if you don't have public procurement, the idea is that the farmer needs income support. Procurement is not the main issue. The main issue is how do you support the farmer's income. So the Niti Aayog is trying to work with these various models, and hopefully we will come up with ideas, because in India we do have so many states trying out their own experiments, and as long as we learn from the best, I think there are ways. It will take time, as I said, not done overnight, but then, well, Rome wasn't built in a day, I guess.
In addition to what Maithili just now pointed out, the Madhya Pradesh Bhavanta scheme and the Telangana's direct income support scheme, I think the budget also refers to old idea but gives fresh impetus, the ENAM, Electronic National Agricultural Marketing Scheme, by which the point that you mentioned, ineffectiveness of the APMCs can be overcome to a great extent if an electronic platform wherein a farmer can actually sell his produce on that vertical. This ENAM idea can be promoted and used effectively by the farming community. It's a big challenge, but I think since you mentioned the budget, what the budget has done to overcome the APMC's functioning and the weaknesses in the system, ENAM is a good idea which can go a long way if used effectively for this purpose.
But how will it work if an idea is rolled out in the union budget, but the issue relates to state governments? How will it work?
I agree with you, but like many issues, this is current subject. So the center sets the ball rolling, and the states will have to join this, and states will have to take part in this ENAM project. And once the ENAM idea is embraced by the states, what you can actually see, a national agricultural marketing platform or a portal can be created where each state be party to it. And I don't see, with technology being available now, it is not something which is impossible.
And to my mind, frankly, cooperative federalism, which we've seen really so wonderfully in the example of GST, which is such a complicated thing, was there it is a question of money and large sums of money. And the center and the states have worked together very well. In fact, they've come to a very good equation. There's much greater understanding. There's much greater. It truly is cooperative federalism. So if we can do that in the case of GST, surely in other areas like, labor and agriculture, which are sectors where both state as well as the union are involved, I think there's no reason why they can't go through satisfactorily. And also in this budget, there is a tax concession that has been given to farmer-producer organizations. So that will be a big help, because a single farmer may not have much clout, but when a number of farmers come together as a farmer-producer organization, then there is strength in numbers, and they will be able to negotiate whether it is with the mandi or through the ENAM, because the fact is, ENAM, you require infrastructure in terms of grading of agriculture commodities, in terms of computer facilities. So I think there are concerted moves to try and do something for the farmers. Of course, it's a long way, so we'll have to keep our fingers crossed.
The finance minister has created a 10,000 crore fund for animal husbandry and fisheries. Now, the only context in which we've heard about animal husbandry is the Chara Ghotala. And frankly, it hasn't ended up very well. So, what is it that we can do in animal husbandry that will warrant the spending of 10,000 crore rupees is a lot of money?
Details are not yet fully available on what he will do with that money, but let us not underestimate the role of animal husbandry and fisheries in agriculture sector. I mean, not often realized that today the share of non-farm sector in the agricultural pie is actually larger than wheat and paddy and crops. You have horticulture, you have got milk, and you have got fisheries, and you have got animal husbandry. The share of these segments is actually now becoming larger than the basic agricultural produce. So a lot can be done, but unfortunately, I think the budget hasn't given us enough details on how that money will be spent and where it will be spent. And of course, these should be spent judiciously and effectively.
For fisheries, for instance, you need cold storage, you need processing, packaging facilities. So these are all things really sorely needed in our country, because we have an abundance of raw material. In fact, even in the case of fruits and vegetables, close to 40% of the fruits and vegetables are just destroyed because we have no means of processing them. Likewise with fish and animal husbandry products. I think it's very important that you thought in terms of setting up an infrastructure fund. As I said, these are all just beginnings, long way to go, but at least you've created the infrastructure, you're trying to make a difference.
The MSME sector has also been given considerable attention in this budget. What exactly does throwing more money at this sector do?
MS sector, my assessment from the budget was there are two major areas where this budget has tried to address the concerns of the MSMEs. At one level, budget has tried to reduce the tax burden on the MSMEs by raising the 25% tax rate to include any company within a turnover of 250 crore. Now that is a big tax gain for these companies. A large number of MSMEs are in these areas where they manufacture consumer goods, consumer items. There the basic custom duty has been raised. So there is debate going on whether the raising of custom duty on these items is a good thing or a bad thing. But the ostensible reason for which this increase in custom duty on items produced by a large number of MSMEs was the capacity utilization level in many of these MSME companies were very low, and they were flooded with imports. So therefore, the idea was to give them some sort of a protection so that they can come into their own and produce more. And since they are also very job-intensive, labor-intensive sectors, so they might help create jobs. My sense is that yes, the tax incentive is a good idea, because many of these MSME sector companies, unlike the large companies, were benefiting from the various tax exemption schemes. So therefore, for them, the effective tax rate was more than the 23% tax rate which the big companies were subjected to. So giving them 25% tax rate from 30% is a good idea, because the effective tax rate is much more than 25%. whereas not giving the big ones the 25% benefit, actually not big loss for them because their effective tax rate is lower than 25% right now.
So you are actually encouraging MSMEs to go beyond the MSME category and become bigger.
Custom duty side, I'm a little ambivalent because it may result in inefficiencies, it may result in lack of necessary competition in any sector. So consumer might not enjoy the prospect of seeing that he doesn't have any choice. So both the decisions, in my view, are decisions that will impact the MSME sector.
But to just add to what AKB said, which I entirely correct and I agree with him, there's also the issue of the government saying that in the case of EPF, the money that is to be paid for the new employees, that the government will subsidize effectively, subsidizing employment. There's another change that they've made in terms of the fixed term contract for labor. So these MSMEs get the necessary labor flexibility which we didn't have under the Industrial Disputes Act. There's also a recapitalization package that has been given to public sector banks. They've been very clearly told that you must give more loans to the MSMEs. So here again, as I said, it is a working process. We'll have to see how far it progresses and then just see how far it goes. But that's where the employment creation is going to come from.
But the State Bank of India chairman Rajneesh Kumar also pointed out that 88% of the loans that have been taken which have not been returned fully are from MSME sector. So I don't know whether that is correct or not, but
in terms of number, yes, but not in terms of value, because the large companies obviously get much a higher amount of loan. But in terms of numbers, most certainly you would be right. But the quantum, if you go by the value, it would definitely be much less.
To the other side of the budget, of course, the budget was almost next to silent on indirect taxes because, as the finance minister himself quipped before the budget, that he may have to curtail his speech because there was no indirect tax part of it. It's another matter that the speech was quite long.
He made good by the long list of custom duty increases, actually.
So how do we look at the custom duty changes that he has made? Some custom duty, some items custom duty has been increased sharply. That will mean a more expensive mobile phone for you and me. But it will also mean that imports will become costlier and you will be forced to produce those items in India. And degree of protectionism that has immediately been attacked by foreign media.
Well, he has done a couple of things on the taxation side. One is that we just now discussed, that raising custom duty on these large number of items. He is, relied on this huge increase in the tax base. And this tax base increase has actually given unusual bonus for him in terms of tax to GDP ratio, which reached a point of 12% of GDP, which recent years it was always hovering at around 10 to 11%. So that tax base widening and the tax to GDP ratio going to 12%, in my view, is a long-term good for the government finances. And finally, I would say that what is also done, very clever manipulation of tax rates, is that he has reduced the excise duties on petrol and diesel and replaced them with cess. In other words, he is actually trying to secure for the center some of the tax revenues on the indirect taxes front, which otherwise he would have to share with the states. So these are the three interesting things that he has done in this budget on the taxation side, quite apart from direct taxes changes.
I think the LTCG tax change, I'm entirely for it because I strongly feel that there are three considerations. One, of course, is the fact that it gives you revenue. Two, is that there's no case whatsoever to treat different asset classes differently. Why should you have a different holding period in the case of stock market shares? Anything over 1 year entitles you to zero long-term capital gains, whereas in the case of land and other capital assets, it is, say, 3 years. So that is from the point of view of equal treatment for all assets, and also from the point of societal equity. Who are the people who invest in the stock market? I know I'm going to become very unpopular with all your viewers who play big on the stock market, but I think this is very necessary because those who invest in the stock market are those who do not need any preferential treatment if over the average level of income in this country. So I think it's entirely right that the government did restore some kind of equity in a very modicum way, because it's only above 10% over 1 lakh and there's a grandfathering clause. So even though the stock market has crashed today by 840 odd points, I don't think one should be scared of what the stock market can do. One really should not lose any sleep over it, to quote the famous Dr. Manmohan Singh's statement in Parliament, for which he got given for so much of flack, but I'm entirely for it.
I entirely agree with Maithili on this. LTCG tax, long-term capital gains tax on equity is a good idea. I will only add that probably along with the imposition of this tax, he should have also removed the securities transaction tax, because remember the history of it, LTCG on equity was taken off, and because securities transaction tax had been introduced in 2005. So if one is coming, the overlapping of these two taxes probably is not a good idea. At some point, the government must review the idea of securities transaction tax on equity transactions.
Except that the amount that the government raised through STT was only about 9,000 crores last year. And if you look at the stock market, it always likes to hold governments to ransom. Every time there was talk about the Mauritius route, all the foreign investors would say, oh well, all hell will break loose, we'll pull out of the country. Why will they pull out of India? Which other countries growing at the rate at which we are growing? So never allow the stock market to dictate to you whether it is Mauritius, whether it is participatory notes. I think those stand firm and you have logic on your side. Ultimately, foreigners will come. And today we're in a situation where frankly we really do not need those dollars. They're keeping the rupee at a much higher level than it should be. I don't think one should get scared. One should stand firm and say we'll do what is good for our citizens and not bother so much about the external world.
Well, if I can just verbalize some anxieties that are being felt by those who are invested in the stock market. In the very short term, it seems as if the current boom in the stock market is fueled by retail investors, most of whom have no other avenue for investment. There is hardly any incentive for savings in this budget. Investors really don't have a choice but to go to invest in mutual funds. And if you are going to impose tax at a time when mutual funds are booming, they have so much cash that they can't count it, there would be some fears about what you might do tomorrow.
I would throw the same question back to you, Aditi. When it is precisely when markets are doing well and they're so out of kilter with the underlying economic fundamentals that you do need to try and put some kind of a dampener, number one. Number two, I think retail investors must understand that investment in the stock market is a risky proposition. Today, the average investor is going to the stock market assuming that the good days of old will continue. That is not true. In the stock markets are good if you have the luxury of choosing your point of exit. If tomorrow stock markets crash and you have to exit at that particular point of time, for whatever reason. Maybe you have a huge expense which you need to kind of suddenly fund and you have to liquidate your stock market holdings and the market has crashed. What do? You might even lose your entire principal, whatever you have invested. So I think this realization that the stock market is a risky investment, that there's no certainty to the return, I think that the retail investor in India is still to internalize. So no sympathy for the stock market investor who's just driven by greed. He must understand, yes, the stock market is risk and reward go hand in hand.
And let me add to what Maithili has said, that it will probably be a little unfair to this budget to say that there is nothing for the ordinary retail investor or the middle class, small income earner. I think there's a 40,000 standard deduction which has been introduced, although in lieu of medical and transport allowances. There is for the senior citizens, there's a 50,000 rupee interest earning from bank deposits have been exempted from your income tax calculation. And in addition to that, 50,000 is for your expenditure on medical health. And so I don't think this budget has completely ignored the concerns of the ordinary Indian taxpayer.
On the senior citizen part of it, yes, there could be some agreement, but there could also be some disagreement. Namely, that if you reach a certain age, it requires no rocket science to know that your premium will go up enormously. And riders will be added one after the other, after the second, after the third, so that the premium that you have to pay far exceeds the expenditure that you may incur without the insurance. Now, the fact is that it's possible that this scheme may be fleshed out properly and may be helpful to senior citizens. But frankly, right now, what it looks like is just a tax saving scheme. Not for senior citizens, but for those who will pay premiums on behalf of the senior citizens to get benefit of the tax saving.
I think the problem really with our healthcare system in India is that we are going the US route, which is a completely wrong way. Yeah. Health insurance is not the answer in a country like India. It has to be public provision of health, like in the case of the UK, as in the case of France. Because these are countries which have excellent models of publicly funded healthcare. And I think that is something that the government can do. I'm not saying that they charge you, it should be completely free. They can charge linked to income levels. But this kind of a situation where you have healthcare insurance and insurance companies, they really take you for a complete ride. I think that must be stopped. We cannot go the US way. The US itself has realized the folly of going down that way. And unfortunately, we're taking the wrong lessons. Why don't we learn from the UK, from France, from the Scandinavian countries? Healthcare must be funded through taxpayer money.
It doesn't require much to set up one major hospital in each of our 600 districts. The government wishes to build capacity in the hospital sector. It can. And many of these districts may already have some hospitals.
Required to be upgraded.
Absolutely.
On the issue of housing, what does this budget have to offer?
Well, there is talk of affordable housing, but I'm not very sure very much has been done, because it's been talked about earlier also, and we do have a couple of companies who are focusing on the affordable housing segment, but we now do have reports of the delinquencies that the NPA levels in this segment actually have gone up very high. So I think there is a bit of the positives as well as negatives are always there. Just because the government is incentivizing affordable housing does not mean that banks and housing finance companies lower their guards and just lend money purely to fulfill certain milestones, as it were. So I think one needs to be a little careful and not just, go chasing targets.
The figures on housing that I have seen, there's good progress in the rural affordable housing segment. Actually, the pace of activity has really picked up. But whereas in the urban affordable housing schemes, one hasn't seen that much activity, probably because of land prices. So rural housing, yes, you have seen some progress, but in urban housing, progress isn't that much.
If we look just a little bit at the macro issues, the biggest issue seems to be fiscal deficit. How should we see this problem? Because it's something that's going to, I think, dog us for the next 2 or 3 years at least. There is growth, but fiscal deficit just doesn't seem to go away.
I'm not too worried about a slippage of 20 basis points going to 3.33% next year. What I am worried about is the statutory provisioning made in this finance bill, which allows the government to reach 3% of fiscal deficit by 2024-25, even though when it comes to announcements, different numbers are being trotted out. So therefore, I think it's important to bind the government, adhere to a fiscal roadmap, and I think the big takeaway from this budget is this, that the finance bill provides for fiscal target to be reached only by 2024-25, which to my mind is a long period and is a 7-year leeway the government gets. So I think the government must tie itself down to a more stronger and more stringent fiscal roadmap obligation, shorter period.
I'm not so worried about the fiscal deficit per se, because I think a slight slippage, as we've seen now, is in fact a pragmatic way of looking at something which is always dynamic and evolving. But worries me more is the revenue deficit. That means the excess of government expenditure on current consumption. You're not creating any asset. You're spending it away on things like pensions, salaries, interest, which don't give you any return at all. And that has reached an all-time high almost. 78% of your fiscal deficit is pure revenue deficit. That even means you're spending without getting any kind of return at all, which is damaging not only for your overall macroeconomic stability, but also in terms of increasing your debt to GDP ratio. And that is something which I think is very worrisome. And again, in the finance bill, as part of the finance bill, the government has attached an amendment to the FRBM Act in terms of which it proposes to do away altogether with revenue deficit. That means the concept itself is going to be dropped. So it's inconvenient to you, so you simply drop it. And that is very bad in terms of transparency, accountability for the government. Do hope the government will reconsider that move.
Maybe it's a fait accompli, because what can you do about the revenue deficit? You can't reduce jobs, you can't ask state governments to reduce jobs. These are all government jobs. People have security of tenure. It's a political issue. There's not, I think, maybe not a lot that you can do with this.
I think there is a lot that you can do. Actually, you can spend much more wisely, much more effectively. There is a great deal of loss, I think, in leakage. Of course, the government is doing things like DBT, direct benefit transfer, which does reduce the leakages. But I think much more needs to be done. And hopefully with GST, it's not just a question of cutting expenses. Your revenues also, if they grow, then your revenue deficit will come down, because it is the difference between your revenue receipts and your revenue expenditure. So with GST, hopefully revenues will increase and the government will not need to have such a high revenue deficit.
How many marks you give this budget out of 10?
I will give it 5.
Well, I would give it 6. It is reasonably responsible, except for, as I said, the revenue deficit aspect distresses me a great deal.
If you were to rank the rest of the 5, say if you were to give, what in your opinion would get the government 6?
In my view, the biggest slippage in this budget on terms of the fiscal consolidation has happened on 2 counts. One, it has overspent hugely on revenue expenditure, and it has not been particular about its non-tax revenues. On both these counts, I think the government has not shown enough commitment to improve its non-tax revenues and been quite lax about its revenue expenditure controls.
What would it take for the government to reach 7 from 6?
I would think that, as I said, they must drop that provision to junk revenue deficit, because that keeps a very tight control on government's overall finances. And some of their assumptions are very unrealistic. I think we need to have more realistic assumptions. Then perhaps I would have given it a 7.
The Indian government has established itself as a caring and thoughtful regime, but much more needs to be done. I think there's no two opinions about it. Thank you very much.
You were listening to a discussion on various aspects of Union Budget. The participants were economic analysts A.K. Bhattacharya and Maithili Bhushnur-Math and Aditi Fadnis, journalists who initiated and moderated the discussion. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can also listen to this program on our website newsonair.nic.in. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsttalks@gmail.com.